Hi, I'm Graeme Daniels. This is my novel. Let's get it in there. Crystal from the Hills. This is a video that is going to provide a synopsis, part one of a two-part video that'll look to provide a synopsis of the novel, its story, line of course. Thanks for clicking on this link. If you don't actually want an outline of the story, if you feel that would spoil it for you if you're planning to read it, and I hope you do, click off this link now and perhaps check out one of my videos that is more about a description of the characters and the themes that are in the subtext of Crystal from the Hills. But this is going to be a bit more straightforward about the story, although I'll include a little bit of commentary about the themes as I go along. So, Crystal from the Hills. It starts out, this is about an accident, a disappearance, a trauma, and a mystery. Above all, this is a mystery novel. And in that opening, you don't hear words like murder or death, and yet the story begins with the description in third-person terms from the main character, my protagonist, who's rendered on the front here, that's the guy, that somebody has died. Specifically, this character named Weed. There's a lot of nicknames in the story, and that's about a theme of fragmented identity, played in somewhat comic terms, but nonetheless it's a serious-minded idea. Weed has at least disappeared. That's the opening of the story. And in the aftermath of that event, Chris, or Crystal, as he is nicknamed, is wandering the streets of Oakland. He is panhandling. He is selling drugs, painkillers mostly, that he's pilfered from a hospital where until recently he was working as a surgical assistant. The story moves on in opening chapters. He's picked up, or rather discovered, sort of on the streets by his recently acquired girlfriend named Jill, who is a nurse at the same hospital that Chris was working at. And she asks where he has been over the previous several days. He's gone missing for a few days, and the entire story actually takes place over just a matter of 4 days. Chris is vague in response to Jill. This is partly he's being cagey, partly he is just manipulating and lying and concealing, sort of pretending as if things, accidents don't happen, that bad things don't happen in life, a sort of childlike quality that will he will present throughout the story, I think. But he's also dissociating. That is a term which refers to an aspect of trauma that he manifests throughout the story. Anyway, he is vague, saying that he's left his apartment where he was living with his friend Weed until recently, that he's had an accident that he is that he says took place, quote, in the hills, and also that he is, and during which that he lost his cell phone and therefore couldn't call anyone like Jill, and that he was just sort of wandering the streets in the aftermath of that. Jill is sort of unconvinced, but generally thinking at this point in the story that Chris has relapsed on a recently halted methamphetamine habit, which he denies actually, and she seems somewhat contemptuous of him for reasons that are not fully expressed here at this point in the story. They go to her apartment, which is in West Oakland. This is nearby, and they agree that he will stay there at least for a few days. She is at the very least ambivalent about making any kind of commitment with him. That will be apparent. And that she insists that he at least do one thing, namely resolve a concurrent dispute with the hospital management, where of course he works. He's been actually suspended from his job, supposedly due to an instance of insubordination with some of the doctors on staff. So in the story, much is happening. But Chris seems distracted, and he is actually preoccupied mostly with these chronic hallucinations from which he suffered for actually much of his life, though until recently they had been dormant for some time. Now, he dubs these hallucinations shadows. They are images of people, and they follow him around, typically at night, but more recently entering into daylight as well, and they whisper these sort of cryptic messages, things like "save lives" or "you're a liar, Chris," things like that. And they are sort of carriers of either conscience or secrets or both. And he sometimes confuses them with real people. That is, Chris sometimes confuses them with real people. Now, moving on, he meets up with another nicknamed friend, this one called Sweet, which is short for Sweet Tooth. And they hang out for a while. Sweet is similarly distractible and itinerant. They catch up on some recent events, including Chris's car accident. Sweet is unconvinced account, but he doesn't argue with him. Sweet is generally an unargumentative character. And they speak of weed, the absent weed, in a sort of waiting for Godot kind of style. And meanwhile, Chris explains about his situation at work as well, the insubordination incident. But he also alludes to a sexual episode with Jill that took place at work, and suggests that that also is a reason why he's being disciplined at work. However, this disclosure seems contrived, and as much as anything, it seems as though Chris here is talking about this as an excuse to describe a sexual conquest. Meanwhile, Sweet interviews Chris. This is apparently a long-standing episodic project of Sweet's. The interview is part of an ambiguously defined film that is something Sweet has been working on for some time. Before this, actually, Chris has gone to breakfast. He is subsisting somewhat on the sale of these pills I mentioned, and also some panhandling. And at breakfast, two things happen. He flirts with a waitress, and also that he introduces an idea he has, a somewhat fanciful idea for the invention of a diaper. This invention idea is an indicator of his creativity or his bizarreness, depending on the reader's point of view, or lack of reality testing, perhaps. He and Sweet eventually separate, though not before Chris has visions of shadows next to Sweet, which triggers a suspicion that Sweet may not be so sweet, so to speak, as he may think, but rather one of these malevolent followers, again dubbed the Shadows. Now anxious, Chris heads back to Jill's apartment, where he will try to hide for some time. There he sort of frets about his work situation, bemoans the sudden decline of not only his libido, but of Jill's interest in him sexually. This reverie is interrupted by a small child, about an 8-year-old boy who lives in the apartment building, clearly neglected or abandoned child, and they have a play episode that is interrupted by Jill, who is somewhat sour but nonetheless caretaking of the little boy. Anyway, the regression episode ends. So this is one of a few instances that are meant to sort of represent Chris's, or reenact Chris's regressed character. The next day, Jill leaves for work while Chris continues to hole up in her apartment, though he warily and unwisely heads outdoors for some modest early morning exercise, during which he basically gets mugged. Though he might have thought this something to expect in a West Oakland neighborhood in the early dawn hours, he basically takes this as confirmation that his stalkers, the Shadows, are closing in on him. He escapes these assailants relatively unharmed, and later calls his friend Sweet and requests that he, Sweet, come and rescue him from this neighborhood. Sweet arrives in a borrowed truck, and gives Chris a ride back to his childhood home in the Oakland Hills, where a rich aunt of Chris's and the only truly remaining truly involved relative in Crystal's life has lived for some time, and is often waiting upon her nephew's somewhat prodigal visits. However, in this ride back to this neighborhood, Sweet, who is a quite haplessly reckless driver, has a near accident, which seems at least a reenactment of the earlier ill-defined trauma of the car accident that is described in the beginning, in which this disappearance and possible death of Weed has occurred. So what happens next is Chris loses it with Sweet, gets angry at him, and this is partly because of the reckless driving, but also because, once again, an image of a shadow appears next to Sweet, and this triggers Chris's paranoia. The two friends separate again, and Chris hikes alone up the hills towards his aunt's home, which is sort of nestled in the woods. As they meet, ultimately, she gushes over his long overdue visit, but upon hearing of car accidents, suspensions from work, affiliations with people with silly names, the elderly and ailing woman rather upbraids him for not taking responsibility for his life. He'd be happier if he just dealt with reality, she insists. Anyway, he stays overnight, and the next morning Chris has a conversation with a somewhat roguish gardener of Aunt Jenny's, and this is an exchange that sort of mirrors the earlier dawdling exchanges between Chris and Sweet. But Cosman, that's the name of this gardener, another nicknamed character, says something that sort of jolts Chris's sense of reality. Now, I won't say what that thing is. That's for the reader to interpret. If the reader, if you read Crystal from the Hills. But Chris returns to Aunt Jenny's company and soon proclaims himself ready to move forward in his life with purpose. Aunt Jenny is pleased, of course, to hear this, but their conversation is interrupted by a knock on the front door of her home. A maid answers and calls Chris to the door, and there waiting are two police officers who say something like the following: "Mr. Levitt, we understand you may know something about a missing person known to you as Weed." So that's a synopsis of the first half to two-thirds of the novel, actually. And if you want to hear the rest, and including the climax and my comments on a little bit more about what this story is about, what it means to me, what it might mean to the reader, wait for Synopsis Part 2. In the meantime, thanks for checking out this video. And if you want to check out, by that I guess I mean purchase, Crystal from the Hills, a novel by Graeme Daniels, psychotherapist. You can go to Amazon.com or its subdivision CreateSpace.com. Here, take a look at that. Thanks again for clicking on this link, and stay tuned for more. All right.